And without further ado, let me invite our first speaker of this afternoon. Please welcome Mr. Tom Vanhoutte, founder and managing partner of Imec.xpand from Belgium.
Thank you very much. Thank you for taking the time on the third day of InnoVEX to come to see the presentation and to hear about what's going to be 30 minutes on a European perspective. And to put it differently, I'm going to talk about the perspective of a European. I mean, I'm not going to speak for all Europeans, I'm just going to speak for myself. And basically, I'm going to use some data that are most of them publicly available to really make a few points and see how I see the opportunities for foreign VCs in Europe and for foreign companies to really build a sustainable business in Europe. So if the numbers don't align with what you're thinking, just look at them as a way for me to help build my argument. Anything that has to do with startup these days is very, very fast changing. So could be that something changed since I made this presentation. Before I start, 1 minute on Imec.xpand. So Imec.xpand is a fund that focuses on nanotechnology innovation. Means that we're one of the very few investors these days that don't scare away of hardware. And the reason why we can do that is because we were working very closely with Imec. Imec is a world-renowned R&D center. Some of you no doubt have heard about, located in Belgium, that's focusing on anything that's nanotechnology and semiconductor innovation, and actually is working with all the big semiconductor players in the world, the TSMCs, the Samsungs, the Applied Materials, the Qualcomms, the Facebooks, name them, and they somehow have a cooperation going on with Imec. If you look at, and this is maybe for people who are looking for financing, if you're in a startup that's in one of the domains that you see here, anything that you can put smart in front, anything that has to do with core CMOS technology, flexible display, sensor technology, or anything that can get enabled by software or security software would be of interest to us as an investor. So feel free that if you're active in one of those domains to stop by and introduce your company. We're geography agnostic, so we'd be happy to talk to you and see how we can help build your company. Okay, let's start with the European perspective. And if you're going to give the European perspective, it's interesting to have a more global macroeconomic view. So if you look at the size of the world economy, you can tell that as far as GDP is concerned, the US is still the biggest economy, much bigger still than China. However, that is GDP based on absolute numbers. If you would look at it from a GDP on purchasing power, the Chinese economy would at this point be much bigger than the US economy already. If you look at the GDP per capita, you can tell that Europe and the US have both numbers that more or less, I mean, there's a significant difference, but range-wise, they're in the same range. The difference in Europe is that it's very different by country. Luxembourg, for instance, has a GDP of 100,000 per capita. Bulgaria has a GDP of 8,000 per capita. So that's also an indication that if you're active in Europe, don't look at it, though we want to talk about the European Union, don't look at it as a unified market. Especially for startup companies, it is very different to do business in the more southern part, in Spain or in Italy, than it is to do business in Finland or in Sweden, or than it is to do business in the Netherlands or Belgium or any other country around. Also, as far as financing is concerned, it's also very much geographically focused. Most of the VC funds somehow have some kind of government involvement as either as a supporter of the fund or as an investor in the fund. most of the time as an investor in the fund, and that would require those companies that get funding to have some kind of an activity in the country that they're located in. So if you're looking to do business in Europe, be aware of that, and also be aware that if you get financing in whatever European country, it could, not necessarily will, but it could come with certain strings attached. When we look at the innovation, however, we get a little bit of a different image. In number one, South Korea. I think Samsung has something to do with that. But there's 5 or 6 European countries in the top 10, and the US is actually only 11th at this Bloomberg Innovation Index. It means that from an innovation perspective, there are plenty of countries in Europe where there's very exciting technology, where there's very innovative minds, where people are working hard to build their company and competing with innovation in the US. Now, you would think if Europe is so innovative, and if the size of the European economy, be it different, but is more or less the size of the US, Europe would do as well as the US in the field of innovation. Not exactly true. If you look at the highest valued startups at this point in time, you can tell that about half of them is currently in the US. There's, let's say, 40% in China, and there's, I think, there's two or three outside the US of China. I think it's Indonesia and Singapore. And surprisingly, there's 0 in Europe. Doesn't mean that there's not highly valued companies in Europe, but there's no companies that have achieved, that are amongst the top 30 of the highest valued startups at this point in time. Now, if you look at the unicorns in 2017 and 2018, and for all clarity, this statistic is companies that became a unicorn, so that achieved the valuation of higher than 1 billion in 2017 or up till today, 2018, you can tell that also predominantly the US and China represent the highest valued companies. There's a few in Europe, and if you would dig into it, you would see that those companies most of them are located in the UK. In mainland Europe, I think there may be 1 unicorn created the last 2 years. So there is still some work to be done, though the innovative and the economic circumstances in Europe are good to create innovation. For some reason, I mean, we haven't had the successful companies that one would expect if you look at those statistics. And there's a number of reasons for that. The first reason I already mentioned, Europe is a very fragmented and very diverse market. It's not because you started your company in the Netherlands that you automatically will be able to scale your business to Germany, to Finland, or to Spain, especially if you're active for instance, in medical field, medical devices, biotech, and you need some kind of regulation. It tends to be different in every country. I mean, reimbursement is different in every country. You have to have specialists on board who can address every market. It's very complicated. So that's one of the reasons why Europe is not achieving its full potential. Another one is more from is more subjective. It's more from a mentality point of view. Failure is still considered something bad in Europe. If you're an entrepreneur and you started your company and you weren't successful, when you do that in the US, for instance, that will be seen as a positive thing. They will look at your experience and they will look at you as someone who gained some skills trying to set up a successful company. And when eventually you start your next startup, I mean, this will be considered, that experience will be considered a plus. If you look at it from Europe, that's not the case. I mean, Europeans are still very critical towards failure, and it's not automatic that they'll see the experience that you build up as a success factor, which obviously could disencourage repeat entrepreneurs to start another venture. Another one I think is very important is the lack of role models and success stories. Success attracts success. There are several ways that success attracts success. If you look at Silicon Valley, for instance, if you look at Facebook, if you look at Google, if you look at Snap, if you look at any company who have had a successful exit or a successful IPO in recent years, at least 1,000 employees became a millionaire as a result of that. All those people have enough money to support the ecosystem. They become angel investors, they become advisors, they support startups, they encourage startups, they inspire startups, they motivate startups. So success attracts success. And it's also, if you look at it from an entrepreneurial perspective, seeing that something is possible, realizing that you can be successful by innovating, by working hard, by working diligently and sacrificing a lot of things, seeing that someone has done it before helps. And we see a lot of entrepreneurs get inspired by existing entrepreneurs, and the lack of role models in Europe does not encourage or inspire people to start innovating. The other thing you see in Europe, and you probably have all been confronted with it if you're looking for money, and we're confronted with it if we're looking for money for investors in our fund, is that on average, large institutional investors in Europe are very risk averse. We don't have the type of endowments or large public pension funds that they have in the US, who invest percentually seeing a rather small amount of money in venture capital, but in absolute terms, a lot of money. 5% of 150 billion is a lot of money. In Europe, you don't see that. Most countries don't have a lot of large pension systems. The concept of endowments is not very well known in Europe as a whole. There may be regions where it's different, more established than in others, but in general, it's not very well known. And the pension funds that exist typically don't invest in European venture capital, which is actually funny because I'm from Belgium and we are very close to the Netherlands, and I always envied my VC colleagues in the Netherlands because they have large VC funds there, pension funds there. They have Alpinvest and they have PGGM and they have APG, companies that have billions of finance companies that have billions of resources, yet none of those actually goes to the Dutch ecosystem. It's obviously up to them to decide what they want to do with their money, and I assume that financial return has something to do with it, but it's still different from the mentality we see in the US. And finally, and that's something that you guys as entrepreneurs will see, European VCs, and we're guilty, we're one of them, are very risk averse. If you think about, I always use it as an example, a company like Juicero in Silicon Valley that had some kind of an advanced juicer. It was a bad idea to start with, my opinion, but they were able to raise 100 million from very reputed entrepreneurs, came to the conclusion that it was just a juicer, and company went eventually bankrupt. But that would never happen in Europe. A European VC is always going to do a very, very diligent due diligence to make sure that a company is fit to invest in, much more than to look at the potential. A US VC wants to see high potential. They want to invest in companies that shoot for the moon, and that there's some risk involved, they'll take it. And they don't care as much about valuation as European VCs do. And I'll come back to that later. The European VC is very sensitive to valuation. A US VC is very sensitive to opportunity. And if you start your company in an ecosystem where you only have to convince a VC of the high potential of your company and not a lot of questions are asked on where are you, show me a prototype, show me a demo, do you have customers, whatever. It makes it a little bit easier to raise money than when you have to have addressed all those steps beforehand. Okay, so what does that mean if you're an investor, an outside investor who wants to invest in Europe, or you're an entrepreneur who wants to come to Europe? It means that it's not because something could be difficult that you should miss out on something great. So you should still consider Europe as a place to start your business or as a place to invest in. And there's several reasons for that. One of the reasons, maybe not interesting for the entrepreneurs, very interesting for the investors, is the valuation. European companies tend to be valued lower than US companies. There's few reasons for that. One I already mentioned is the fact that European VCs are much more critical in the due diligence process, are much more sensitive to valuation, which means that if the valuation runs up, they'll just tap out. They won't necessarily try to compete with each other on valuation, which obviously drives the value up. They're going to leave the opportunity to someone else or enter into the opportunity later. That being said, the average funds and the average deals in Europe are smaller. And think about the economics. If you have smaller funds with less financial resources, obviously you'll have lower value deals because any fund will have some fund economics they have to obey by. Some of the economics will be that you can only invest 15% of the fund in one opportunity, which means that if you're the SoftBank Vision Fund, that's several billions, and if you're another fund that has raised 50 million, that is 7.5 million. Obviously, competing to each other, those type of funds competing in the same deal or active in the same deal will keep the valuations a little bit lower. What's also interesting about this graph is that the evolution in Europe and in the US is very similar. If you look at the number of deals, you can tell that the graph follows more or less the same line. If you look at the size of the total deal value in US dollars, you see that the evolution is the same, but Europe is much, much lower than the US. Now, if you think about, does it really matter that the deal size in Europe is smaller? I mean, yes, it does. It does for several reasons. One of the reasons is that, I mean, the top reason why startup companies fail is because there's no market. Obvious. The second reason, however, why startup companies fail is because lack of financing. And lack of financing doesn't mean that it's a bad company. Lack of financing means that you raised your first round of financing that was not sufficient to reach a milestone, and as a result, you had to go raise your next round of financing too early. And you can raise a first round of financing based on the dream. You can do that with a fund, you can do that with a company. You have a good story, you build up a story, you'll raise some financing. But the second time around, you have to have data. You have to have achieved something. You need fact. It's much, much more difficult to raise money the second time around. So if you're a startup company, and the graph on the right-hand side for you shows that you have to raise a minimum amount of money to be relatively certain that you'll be able to raise your next round. And that minimum amount of money is especially important in the early stages of your company because of the reasons I just mentioned. So the graphs show that if you can raise anywhere between, as you can tell, up to around 2.5 million in a seed round of financing, your chances of raising an A round are significantly higher than when you don't raise that amount of money. And everything above that seems to be, as you can tell from the statistic, less important. It basically has to do is make sure that you have enough money to achieve a milestone that will convince investors to enter into your A round, or if you're in the A round, to enter into a B round. The startup dilemma. If you're a startup company and you have a disruptive idea and you have a great team and you have an amazing market, you have a business plan, you know how you're going to approach your market, and you may even have customers already, it's not easy to find, it's not difficult to find money. You will find money. You'll even find money at the mega funds, as I mentioned, the Andreessen Horowitz, the Sequoias, the Index Ventures, the SoftBank Venture Fund, funds that manage over $1 billion or tens of billions in assets will be interested in your opportunity. Those type of companies are basically the PE companies, the private equity companies of venture capital. Now, if you don't have customers, if you don't have a market approach, but you have a great idea or you have a great team, but there's still a lot to be developed, it's much more difficult to find money. And one of the things that at Imec.xpand we try to do differently is we try to identify companies that have a great idea, that have a great team, but that still have some work to do. And we try to provide them with sufficient financing, I mean 2.5, 3 million, to give them the opportunity to grow their company. And we don't want you as an entrepreneur to go fundraise all the time, because you didn't become an entrepreneur to go back for money. I mean, you became an entrepreneur to create a company. It's because you're innovative, it's because you're creative, it's not because you're a great fundraiser. So the VCs you work with, the financiers you work with, should respect that, and they should give you the opportunity to really grow your company. So maybe a few tips now goes both to the entrepreneurs, and it goes also to the VCs that may be in the room. If you're looking, and it's actually a little bit geographically agnostic. I mean, if you don't have a lot of money, if you don't have 100 billion like the Vision Fund, how can you still be successful in early stage investing? I mean, what approach could help you to be successful? And the first and foremost is strike first. Maybe a little. Does anyone know who this is? No, I'm not sure if he's even famous here. It's Cristiano Ronaldo. At age 12, got transferred from Sporting Club de Portugal to Sporting Club de Portugal for £1,500. About 13 years later, same person got transferred to Real Madrid for £80 million, which was at the time the most expensive transfer in the world. I haven't done the math, maybe I should, but this is, from an investment perspective, this is a nice multiple. Another example, maybe not a popular person to show anymore, but anyone know who this is? This is Peter Thiel. Peter Thiel invested in the A round of Facebook, invested 500,000 euro. He made some money with PayPal. And I mean, the numbers, it's not entirely clear if he bought additional shares or whatnot, but he exited at over $1 billion at the IPO. This is a 2000x return on investment. It means that if you have the eye to identify exciting opportunities early on, you can still make a lot of money. And if you're a VC, it is your job to identify exciting opportunities very early on. And you get paid to take the risk to finance the companies you believe in, because they will generate a return for your investors. If you're an entrepreneur, don't buy it when a VC tells you you're not far enough along, or you need to show me this, or you need to do that before I'm going to look at your opportunity. If they believe in you, if they believe it's a good idea, they should invest, because it's really the only way to make money. Another example, another tip is, you have to bring more to the table than cash. That goes, if you start working with a VC, or if you're a VC, don't just offer money. There's plenty of people who can give money. There's more than enough people who have money. There's not a lot of people who can create value for your company. So in our case, thanks to the very close collaboration we have with Imec, we can give entrepreneurs access to low-volume manufacturing. We can give them access to expertise. We can give them access to infrastructure. We can give them access to a state-of-the-art CapEx light innovation in what is a very CapEx-intensive sector. So please look for people who can help you grow. money is one thing, but there's much other things that can help you become successful with your company. And then, as a last example, be contrarian. Don't go with the flow. I mean, you've seen this slide before. I'm sure somewhere this week, data is the new oil. Okay? If you've seen I'm not sure if anyone of Samsung is here. If you've seen presentations of Samsung people, you can tell, especially at the innovation side, they become or want to become more and more a data company because they, and rightfully so, realize the value in data. Now, if you look at the Samsung annual report, however, 60% of the revenue and even more of the profit is coming from their memory business, not from data, from memory. And the way the economy goes today, that's probably only going to grow. So data is the new oil, yes, but you have to look at enabling technologies that will help this data to become successful and that will help you to gather data. Give you an example. Today, a lot of people look at data, the personalized self. Data about yourself will help your doctor to make certain decisions on your health, on your well-being. Now, do you really want those decisions to be made on shoddy hardware? Do you want this to be made on a sensor that you don't trust? Do you want the transformation of this data to be flawed? No. If you look at Theranos as an example, company went bankrupt. I mean, a medical device company that was going to analyze your blood with a single drop of blood. The reality was that the company could not do that, but did still send information to patients based on which medical decisions were made that turned out not to be accurate. So you want to make sure that the way the data are generated, especially in those cases, that that's solid. Another example, self-driving cars. I mean, we're all talking about self-driving cars. However, if you think about the wireless network that will be necessary to support self-driving cars, that's not there today. There is no network that can support a self-driving car for everyone. So you need better wireless technology, or you need data management on a chip. You need to process the data on the chip so you can send information to the cloud. Don't send data to the cloud and get information back. Gather the data on the chip, process them on the chip, and send information to the cloud. If we're not going to work like that, there's no way that self-driving cars will ever happen. So it does require innovation in hardware. It does require innovation in enabling technologies in order to make the data revolution possible. And as an example, I mean, from a long time ago, I mean, if you say that oil was generated an industrial revolution, which is true, I mean, in order to fuel, no pun intended, that revolution, you need to get more and more oil. And the only way to do that was also to innovate in the enabling technologies. I mean, you needed better oil rigs. If there were no innovation in the oil rigs, there wouldn't be enough oil to fuel any revolution. So people who have invested in that, and by the way, if you look at today at Shell, at BP, at Exxon, they're still investing heavily in enabling technologies. They're investing in materials, they're investing in chemicals, they're investing in battery technology, they're investing in anything that can help them generate more oil that then can be used to fuel a revolution. Same thing goes for data. I mean, you can invest in data companies, in data mining companies, in AI companies, but think about the companies that will enable all that. There could be very exciting opportunities there as well. And then finally, and that's out of our role, I mean, this is our own, this is what we do, embrace hardware. And a few years ago, investors shied away from hardware for all the right reasons. First of all, it does cost an excessive amount of money to invest in hardware companies. There was no evidence that hardware companies could become successful. But recently, and there's a few examples there, and there's quite some other ones, it has been shown that there's money to be made in hardware as well. It's not easy. it's different, but still it's something that should be considered also from a VC perspective, especially if you can reduce the capital expenses. It could be a very interesting domain to be active in. And if you're going to invest in hardware anyways, and if you want to be invested in hardware, why not in Europe? Because there's quite some very high potential, and there's actually one here today, a Belgian company called Sensulus, so go ahead and go check them out. There's quite some companies in Europe that are very active in hardware and that have high potential to become the next unicorn and who can generate a lot of financial return for the investors. That's it for me today. If you have any questions, I'll be here. Feel free to swing by, and I'll be happy to interact with you. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, let's have a round of applause for Mr. Vanhoutte. Thank you, sir. Thank you very much.